again. Welcome everyone. My name is Alexa and I'll be your host today. Thanks for joining us for 5 reasons why Agile isn't working with Jeff Payne. First, I would like to go over some features in Adobe Connect that you can use during today's web seminar. If you missed a chance to download the copy of the seminar materials on the previous screen, I'll be happy to post them again at the end of today's seminar. All comments posted in chat are visible to everyone by default. If you experience any sort of technical difficulty and need assistance, in the upper right-hand corner of the chat panel, select Start Chat With, and then my name, Alexa Angel, to begin a private chat, and I can help you immediately. You can use the status menu located next to the main menu navigation at the top of your screen to show agreement, ask the speaker to speak louder, or share some applause.
Good day, everybody. How you? As Alexa mentioned, my name is Jeff Payne. I'm the CEO and founder of Coveros. A little bit on my background. So I've been building and testing software for a long time, almost 30 years now, heaven forbid, and have had the opportunity to run a couple of software companies. We're going to talk about Coveros here in a second, but in addition to that, I do a lot of writing and speaking, blogging and tweeting, all around Agile, DevOps, test automation, application security, DevSecOps. If these are of interest to you, please follow me on Twitter at Jeffery E. Payne. And I'm also the technical editor for the Agile Connection community, which is an online community of Agile and DevOps practitioners. It is free. If you're interested in these subjects, we publish new articles every week on Agile and DevOps topics, everything from process to technology to coaching to enterprise topics. Definitely feel free to get on Agile Connection and register. So as mentioned, I run a company called Coveros. Those of you that aren't familiar with Coveros, we help organizations accelerate the delivery of secure and reliable software, and we use Agile methods to do it. We are a pure play Agile software development company with a specialty in helping organizations enable themselves to do these things. We do everything from Agile transformations to rolling up our sleeves and building and testing software with Agile, to teaching you how to do those things, to putting in place DevOps and CI/CD practices, integrating security into DevOps, and doing software security analysis and assurance on applications themselves. We do have a lot of courses on Agile DevOps security and training, which we provide to the market in all sorts of ways, public classes in various areas around the United States, on-site private classes, live virtual classes that anybody can get to, and e-learning classes as well. We also do have also a couple of open source products that are freely available. Obviously, one is Secure CI. It's a DevOps and DevSecOps tool chain. It's a pre-integrated set of kind of standard open source tools you use to build, test, and deploy software, as well as Selenified, which is an open source Agile testing framework that sits on top of Selenium and makes Selenium a lot easier to use. So I would encourage you to check out some of those things as well. So that's a little bit about me. I wanted to jump quickly over and do a quick poll on, tell me a little bit about you. What is the role you play in the organization? And if you don't fit any of these roles, put your role down as other and just post in the chat what your role is, so we have a good idea of who is here today participating in this webinar. Okay, let me broadcast the results so you can see them. Interestingly, almost half the people on this webinar are from a testing role. We also have a pretty big percentage that are in management / our Scrum Masters, and smaller percentages of developers, testers, product owners, and I don't know that anyone has fessed up to what their role is if they picked others, but we can get back to that if you community engagement. Great. Awesome. So a good spectrum of folks across the organization. So here's the agenda for this webinar. I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about how I collected up the information that I'm going to present today. And then I'm going to talk about 5 things that for me are the most common reasons why Agile doesn't work. There's obviously lots of others and of course more specifics in these various areas, but in a 1-hour webinar, I think these are great topics to cover. After we go through those, we'll do a quick poll to see where the audience is in terms of where you're perhaps struggling across these areas. And then we will do a Q&A and wrap up. So we will leave time for questions. If I don't cover something you want to know, please ask a question, put it in chat. If you want to ask me later, just you know how to reach me with my Twitter address. So as I mentioned, Coveros has been doing Agile for about 10 plus years since I started the company in 2008. And we've done a lot of assessments. Usually when an organization brings us in, the first thing they want us to do is kind of assess where they're at from a maturity perspective. So we have an assessment model that we built nearly 10 years ago. We've done over 200 assessments of organizations, applications, teams, et cetera. And we can provide this data and do this analysis at everything from a team level, if you're just interested in understanding where your team is from a maturity perspective, to where you are as an enterprise. And as mentioned, we gather up this information, we use it to benchmark organizations so people can know where they stand in terms of their maturity with others. And out of that, we can call trends on what are the areas that most people are struggling with or having difficulty with across the different things that we do in Agile. And that's where the data comes from that I'm going to present today. So let's jump right into it. So the first reason Agile doesn't work in an organization is because of what I call Scrum or Fall. So many organizations adopt Scrum, which is a very viable approach to implementing Agile in the organization, but they often forget that Scrum really focuses on managing the work during sprints and during a project and during releases, and it focuses on managing the requirements. In Agile, of course, we call those user stories. That's what Scrum is about, and that's what it's for. And that's very important. But if we don't change the way we design, build, and test software down in the trenches in our sprints, we will suffer. And that's called Scrum or Fall, where we're using Scrum to manage the process and manage our requirements, but our team down in the trenches is still following a traditional waterfall process. I've got 4 examples of different models of Scrum or Fall that I've seen. And I'm sure there's many others out there, but I want to share 4 with you and see if you see yourself in any of these models. And for fun, I gave them all names. The first one's what I call Scrum or Fall Classic. This one has been around since the beginning of Agile. And that is where we are doing sprints, but inside of our sprints, our teams are 100% still waterfall. Design is done first, and then it's thrown over the wall to development. And then when development is done, it's thrown over the wall to test. Now, any of you that have been involved in a project or an organization that does Scrum or Fall, you know what one of the pitfalls of this is. Just like in our classic waterfall processes, testing never gets anything until the last possible second. The other problem, of course, is because sprints are short, typically 2 weeks, maybe it's 3, maybe it's 1, 2 weeks are very common. We have to do these things really fast. So we have to not only follow a waterfall process, which we know inherently is a struggle, but we have to do it really quickly, which puts a lot of pressure on the team to deliver. Now, some teams that start like this struggle and testing starts to fall off the end and start having trouble. And so they might move to what I call Scrum Fall version 2.0. And I see this actually quite often. And Scrum Fall 2.0 looks like this. An organization says, well, we couldn't get everything done in our sprint, so here's what we're going to do. In sprint 1, we're going to design a piece of software. And then in sprint 2, we're going to develop that software that we designed in sprint 1. And oh, by the way, since we have some designers sitting around twiddling their thumbs, we're going to have them start designing the next stuff. And then in sprint 3, we're actually going to get around to testing what we built in sprint 2 and what we designed in sprint 1. But since we have developers and testers around, we better have them following on and doing the next set of work. And so now we're doing all these activities in parallel. And at first blush, we're saying, oh, that's great. We're doing design and dev and testing all during a sprint. That's good. We're keeping everybody busy. We're not in a waterfall method where we're all sitting and testing, waiting for the next thing to come down the pike. We should have something to do, design, dev, and test every sprint. Of course, the problem with this is our goal in a sprint is to deliver working software at the end of that sprint because we're trying to get it in front of the customer as quick as possible. And in this model, we're not going to have anything to show to a customer for 3 sprints. And oh, by the way, when we find problems during testing in sprint 3 for the stuff we designed in sprint 1, and we have to get bugs fixed or the design modified or something else happens, those people are busy doing other things now that they have committed to in sprint 3, and now we have to go back to our earlier sprints. It doesn't work very well to use Scrum Fall version 2.0 in Agile. It's not Agile. The third one I call Scrum Fall Federal. So we're here in DC, and so we do run into the feds. You know, there are a few of them around here in DC, and we have done some work for the federal government. And like any industry, there's good and bad practices. But this is something we often see in the federal government, which is because the federal government often gives contracts to different kinds of organizations, you often see different organizations owning different phases of the life cycle. So you will see people who work with the business side to plan things out and define requirements. You'll see another contractor who is responsible for building the software, and then you'll see someone else completely separately that's responsible for what you might call verification and validation. Maybe it's independent, maybe it's part of dev, but they might be a completely separate team and contract as well. And so what you end up with often is there's a huge planning and design phase up front that's done first. And then we do a series of development sprints, right? Where we start incrementally working off of this design we build up front. And then at some point we throw code over to verification and validation, aka system test or independent test, and they test what we've created. Now, this doesn't look like Agile to me either, and it's not, but it's very common in the federal government. Last but not least, in an ode to today's modern world and millennials, well, I'll call this Scrum Fall Next Gen. And I quite honestly don't know what this is other than a way to characterize and call your waterfall process Scrum. There was a customer we had that experienced this, right? So what they did was they wrapped sprints around each of the phases of their waterfall process. So in sprint 1, they did design. In sprint 2, they did development. In sprint 3, they did test. Doesn't look like Agile to me either. So usually Scrum Fall happens when the business side of an organization has decided they want to adopt Agile, but in from the team itself, those designing, building, and testing, that Agile means they need to work differently now. And because of that, the teams do what they've always done before. And a lot of times just don't even know any better because no one ever trained them or taught them that there was a better way to do this. All they know now is they have to get design, dev, and test done really fast in sprints. Now, what happens if you try to follow Scrum or Fall? The reason why it doesn't typically work is, first of all, your sprints tend to get longer and longer. When we go into an organization and they say, well, I started with a 2-week sprint, but we really struggled with getting all the work done, so we moved it to 3 weeks. That didn't work. Then we moved it to 4. Then we moved it to 6. You see what's happening. They're solving the problem in the wrong way. It's not the duration of the sprint, it's the work and how it's being done in the sprint that needs to be corrected. I always joke and say, well, why don't you just follow your own process and deliver something in a year? We'll wrap one sprint around it and we'll call it Agile, right? Because that's what you're doing when you do that. You're just elongating back to a waterfall process and releases that were every 6 months or a year in duration. The second thing you see is testing getting moved out of the sprints. And so I mentioned in the Scrum or Fall 2.0, this parallel idea. The other thing you see is the creation of what some organizations call a hardening sprint, right? All a hardening sprint is that you're testing, right? They've just moved testing out because they can't figure out how to integrate it in, and they've created an own separate sprint for it. Again, you're moving right back to waterfall. And the point is that when you follow Scrum or Fall and you start having these things, sprints start getting longer, you start doing things in parallel, you start elongating your sprints, you're elongating your feedback loops. And the reality is you're no longer getting working software produced at the end of every sprint. And that's the goal in Agile, is to always deliver something that works. What do you do if you're in this situation? Well, I can't give you all the answers in this webinar, but I'll give you some. This is a very simple process associated with what you could do in a sprint to get your developers and testers working together. So you see up top in our sprint, the input to that sprint are user stories that have been created. The output of that sprint is either working code, as we call it in Agile, or releasable code if we're moving toward a DevOps model of trying to release very frequently. But what we do in the sprint up front is on the left. We do what's called in extreme programming team-based design, and that means think through based on the user stories, what's the design of our software going to look like after we do our implementation, and make sure everybody is in that meeting and everybody understands what's going to come out of this sprint. Then we create acceptance criteria associated with the stories so that we know specifically what has to work and how it has to work for us to meet what the product owner is expecting to come out of this sprint. From our acceptance criteria, we create our acceptance tests up front so we can hand those off to the developer and they have a set of tests they can start testing against even before they have any code that's built. The developers go off, they build the code, they run their acceptance tests, they refactor if any of the unit tests or any of the acceptance tests don't work. They work hand in hand with the testers to make sure that we are building the right thing against the acceptance criteria and the user stories that we have. The testers are toggling their time between working with the developers, creating more acceptance tests and other tests that development can use, even reviewing and auditing the unit tests and other things the developers are doing, but also creating integration and exploratory tests to further assure that the design holds together and works across the various user stories that are being implemented. Now that's really easy to say, that doesn't mean it's easy to do. Some of the things you can do to start moving toward this model of interaction where developers and testers are working together day to day, and I would even argue minute by minute, are listed in the bullets below. So if you're familiar with behavioral driven development, a lot of people mistake that to mean that's a testing technique. Others say, no, it's a development technique. Well, we're finishing up a brand new course on BDD, and our emphasis is that it is really just a way to get the business, development, and test all aligned and on the same page about the stories and the criteria for those stories to work as we enter and go through our sprints. If we can get, they call them the three amigos, product owner, right, dev lead, test lead, all on the same page, and we can share that with everybody else on the team, and we all understand what are the behaviors that are supposed to be done by the software that by the end of this sprint are going to be in the code and are going to be adequately tested against our criteria. That is our goal. It's getting everybody on the same page. And if you do that, it's a lot easier for everybody to work together because they all understand the mission of the sprint. Second is you've got to get your definition of done, which is really a definition of what it means to be finished with a sprint. You've got to make sure that definition includes that working code comes out of the sprint. And working code means it's not only been designed, not only been built, it's not only been tested, but it's been tested against some sort of exit or acceptance criteria that says it's good enough. When we do acceptance testing, we've got our acceptance criteria to base it on, so that one's pretty easy to align. But we need it for unit tests, we need it for integration tests, and the other types of testing that we're doing. Make sure you define your definition of done as quantifiably as you can. The last thing is if you're having trouble getting your developers and testers to work together, pair them, right? Agile is big on pair programming. How about pair dev testing? Get your devs and tests assigned and working together on stories and helping each other. And I wrote a paper on this for Better Software, and I can send it to anybody that's interested, giving you some ideas about what your developers and testers can do together during a sprint to not only help each other, but start to build a relationship and make dev and test closer so they're working together really day to day. So that's number one. Number two is lack of automation. So without some amount of automation, working code eventually will not be produced in every sprint, right? Up front, you might be able to perform design, development, and test in a way that's manual and successfully completes in 2 weeks. But ultimately, it won't work. And here's why. I always say Agile is like a Russian doll. If you're familiar with a Russian doll, it's a doll that you can crack apart, and under it is a smaller doll, and you can crack that apart, and there's a smaller doll, and it just keeps going. There could be 5, 6, 7, 8 layers of dolls encompassed in a bigger doll. Right? Now, why is Agile like a Russian doll? Well, it's simple. When you start your first sprint and it's a brand new project, so you have no code, it's really easy to build and test in that first sprint because all you have to build is, whatever it is the story is. You don't have to do that and refactor and integrate it with anything else. And you just have to test to make sure those stories work properly. And if there's integration between them, they integrate properly. Sprint 2, you not only have to do all that work, but now I have to make sure the things I implemented in Sprint 2 work properly with Sprint 1 and from an interface perspective. And I have to regression test that anything I did in Sprint 2 didn't break what I built in Sprint 1. In Sprint 3, we have to do that against 2 and 1. In Sprint 4, we have to do that against 3, 2, and 1. So the refactoring time and cost, the implementation cost, and the testing cost will grow over time. It's almost like you're concealing your code in another Russian doll. And eventually, it'll just become too much. You won't be able to manually build and test your code in the sprint and meet your definition of done. Common results, things we just talked about in Scrum or Fall. Teams will be forced to elongate their sprints. So this is another reason why you often see sprints grow, because no automation is being done for dev and test. Or we shift to a Scrum or Fall model where the teams just say, I can't figure out how to make this all work in Agile. Let's just do it the way we used to do it inside of our sprints. The reality is, whichever one of these happens, you're going to get code that doesn't work eventually, and it means you're going to be behind. What do you do? I'm not going to run through these in detail, but there's two core fundamental things that over time you need to build up from an automation perspective. The first is continuous integration. You have to have a mechanism for continually testing and integrating your code as it's built. And we're talking every day, and it needs to be completely automated. It needs to be tied into your version control system, and it needs to do regression testing for you so you don't have to try to do that yourself manually. Your definition of done needs to be worked in there. We call those quality gates. And you're going to do any and all types of testing you feel like you can do as small changes are made in your code. The second thing we have to do is automate some amount of our testing activity. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that all testing needs to be automated. There are organizations who do that. That's a whole other discussion we can have, and I did cover that in an earlier webinar for anyone interested. But we do want to automate what I'll call the repetitive testing activities. Some people these days are calling that automated checking instead of testing. Really checking that things that used to work still work, et cetera, et cetera. You can call it whatever you want. I don't care what you call it, just do it. And that means automating your regression tests. You initially probably don't have any automated regression tests. That's okay. As you start building tests in your sprint, some amount of time needs to be spent automating those tests. So you're starting to increase and create a regression suite that you can run every day to make sure things that used to work still work. Your unit testing. Your developers must do unit testing in Agile. If you know anything about the automation pyramid, you know that unit testing is kind of the foundation of automated testing in Agile. And if you don't find problems that are introduced at the unit level, they get harder and harder to find as we move toward a complete system. Developers need to do unit testing, and it needs to be against a criteria that you think is acceptable for how much unit testing is performed. And that is automated. Don't let anybody tell you they're doing manual unit testing. That makes absolutely no sense, right? We typically at Coveros write smoke tests. Any test environment that we're pushing code to, whether it's individual components or release candidates or whatever they are, before we spend precious time and effort, whether it's manual or automated, running regression and running functional tests and non-functional tests and security tests, we first make sure that the environment was stood up properly, the application comes up on that environment, it's been configured correctly, and it seems to work. And if it doesn't, then we have a problem and we need to fix that before we invest a lot in testing. And then there's other kinds of testing that are automated and pretty easy to at least run some of it during our sprints. Performance analysis, load and stress, web security testing, static code analysis for quality and security. As you get more sophisticated, all of those things can start to be automated, and there's good tools out there to help you automate that stuff. So reason number 3, I'll call it ever-changing requirements. So while Agile is really big on change, right? One of the Agile principles is embrace change, even if late in the life cycle. Ooh, that sounds great, doesn't it? Unfortunately, what that means for some is that you can always change and you never have to stabilize on a set of requirements, for instance. While Agile does encourage change and it's built to embrace change, no software development approach, whether it's Agile, Waterfall, RUP, iterative, incremental, spiral, whatever it is, cannot handle instability of requirements, meaning eventually they have to stabilize into something that you're going to build. Otherwise, you don't ever know what to build and you're not going to deliver anything of value. As an example, I want to talk through what happened on one particular project that we were engaged with. It was a very large-scale healthcare system that was being implemented. And we were providing coaching on this project in one particular area. And we were doing some DevOps work, but we were not responsible for the development and the testing of this, nor the relationship with the customer. So we were observing it and helping, but we were not addressing and dealing with requirements and user stories and implementation. This was a scenario where the requirements changed all the time. And by all the time, I mean every single day, right? A product owner would come back from a meeting with stakeholders and others associated with this project with some firm priorities and direction. The team would plan those out and would start a sprint. And the next day, the product owner would come back and say, forget everything I talked about yesterday. Somebody wasn't in the room that needed to be there, and we need to change it all and go a different direction. And sometimes it would toggle back and forth every day. Our suspicion, observing this from afar, was that there were two stakeholders that were fighting over what was most important. And we couldn't see that, right? So stories were changing constantly, and they were changing in sprint, which is a big no-no to me. In general, you shouldn't have to swap in and out stories during sprints. We're only talking about a week or two of effort here. What is so critical that you need to swap something in and out in the middle of a sprint? Now, there are exceptions. Occasionally something will pop up. It's something that a customer wants, and it is deemed important enough that we are going to shuffle things around a bit because we think there's some business value. That will happen occasionally in any project, and there's nothing wrong with deciding to do that. It's when those kinds of exceptions become the rule and they're now how it works every day that you have a problem, because you will never deliver value if things change every day. So just to give you some idea of what happened with this system, some metrics and information for you that I can share. So when this system launched, on schedule, first metric, only 12 concurrent users could access the system at the same time. The plan was for 250,000 people currently get on and use the system. So missed it by a lot. Now, some would argue because, and I heard this argument, the system wasn't properly load tested. Well, there's something interesting about load testing. If the software doesn't work, you can't load test. There were great load test plans. They had great load test scenarios, automation in place. Everything was there. And the organization tried many, many times to load test this system, but it crashed constantly because the software didn't work. So it fundamentally wasn't at all about load testing. The second stat I'll share with you is this system, when it came out, was supposed to allow between 500,000 and 1 million customers to register on the system. And in a week, in the first week it was launched, 6 customers got through the registration process in the first day. Not exactly going to scale to the goals that we wanted to see. And all this was very frustrating for the organization who was building this. The people on the ground were as frustrated as anybody else was about some of the challenges that were exhibited around the constantly changing requirements. So much so that we did a quick, back of the napkin analysis of the comings and goings of the people involved in this project. And our estimate was the turnover rate on this project was somewhere around 200% a year, which is the highest turnover rate I've ever heard of for a project. So what do you do if you have ever-changing requirements? I'll give you some ideas. The first is focus on the problem. For those of you that are going to run out and sign up for free to Agile Connection, or you're already a member of Agile Connection, there's an article coming out in the next month about this. And that is that a lot of times stakeholders and product owners spend a lot of time trying to figure out what is the solution, what are the stories, what are the requirements, what are we going to ask the team to build, when instead what they should be focusing in on is what is the problem we're trying to solve. Because a lot of times if you talk about the problem, the stakeholders can all agree on what the problem is that's most important. And then you can start to define requirements that allow a team to figure out, how do I solve the problem based on these requirements? So taking a step back and working with the customer and the stakeholders to drill into what the problem is we're trying to solve, and then look at the different competing stories or priorities to figure out what is most important to solve the problem, can zero your stakeholders in on the answer. The second thing you need to do is make requirements visible. We teach a fundamentals of Agile class throughout the year. One of the things I always tell people in the class is that the problem with product owners, with customers, is that they don't know what they want until they see it. And that's a big problem. In Waterfall, it's a killer, because you might not see it, they might not see it for 6 months or a year. The whole idea behind Agile is let's get eyes on what we're building as soon as possible. And I would argue that in Agile, our requirements process for a user story actually doesn't end until user acceptance test at the end of a sprint. That is when eyes are put on the requirement in terms of working software, and we really find out whether we built something that the customer wanted or not. Now, there's other ways to make the requirements visible as well. One is to mock or diagram and lay out user interfaces up front as part of design, so that your customers can visualize what the requirements are going to look like, at least visually, right? It doesn't say anything about the algorithms used or whatnot underneath it, but at least they can see it and they can visualize it, and that can help them clarify in their minds what they're really looking for. Last but not least, let's face it, sometimes our business, while they hopefully understand a lot about the end customer, sometimes they're not really sure what the end customer really wants. It's hard, right? Because customers don't know what they want until they see it either. And so you've got to get your end customers in the Agile loop. I'm a big fan of asking end customers occasionally to act as user acceptance testers. Call them something else, beta testers, alpha testers, whatever it is, to get them and entice them to be involved. Second, give constant demos to early adopters and other people who are in your customer base, so you can get feedback from the actual customers as quickly as possible. Now, I've had organizations say, oh, customers will never give us the time to do that. Well, go to customer service and you'll find out there are certain people who will definitely make that time. They're the people that constantly give ideas and send in new ideas for features and other things they want. And they're the people that complain because something doesn't work and something doesn't do what it's supposed to, and they didn't get what they thought they were going to get. There are customers out there that will participate if you go figure out who they are. Reason number 4, lack of executive buy-in. Without some kind of what I call air cover for your Agile initiative, the success rate you're going to have in rolling out Agile in the organization, unfortunately, is going to plummet. It's going to plummet because you don't have buy-in from above. You have to have some level of buy-in if you're going to make Agile successful across the organization. Perfect example. We were doing an Agile transformation at a Fortune 1000 technology company, and we ran into this exact problem. situation was the software group had made the decision to move to Agile, mainly because they had spent a year trying to define requirements and getting frustrated because they could never lock down the requirements and actually get past requirements into design and development. And they were looking for a different approach than trying to define the requirements all up front. And they stumbled upon Agile, and they agreed to have us come in and do an Agile assessment and then move into helping them, put in place Agile and roll it out. They did not socialize this up the chain to their senior management. They had their own budget. They had their own person in charge. They didn't really feel like they needed to. They also didn't socialize it with their peers, the security group, the IT group, even product ownership didn't know this was happening. They really didn't socialize it to anybody else who was going to be touched by Agile. And Agile touches everything, right? Ultimately, if you're going to make it successful, you're going to need things from other people in other groups. And whether they're Agile or not, you're going to have some kind of relationship to get what you want when you need it, or it's not going to work. Interestingly, what happened was we set up an interview schedule. We went in, we started to assess the organization. As part of that, we asked for permission to talk to some of the other leaders, the peer groups, just to get an idea of what they did and how they interacted with software and what they knew about Agile. And we did a couple of those the very first day, and the phone rang almost immediately. And in the conference room, and I was like, oh, what's this? Picked up the phone. It was a senior VP who ran this entire group and never met this person. And he said, hey, are you the consultants doing the Agile assessment? And I said, yeah, that's us. And he said, well, unfortunately, you're going to have to stop because I'm getting complaints already on what you're covering, and people are feeling like you're stepping out of your boundaries. I was like, whoa, that's a big mouthful on day one. So the result was that peer leadership complained. They didn't like the fact that people were asking questions about how they did their work and how that work fit into software and whether they were Agile or not. And they complained to the big boss, who had not been given a heads up that this was even happening. So we had to pretty much reset, go back through the software group, get to the senior exec, brief the senior exec. He actually became a huge fan of Agile. He got the value prop very quickly, and he helped socialize to the other senior managers the importance of this and the benefit of this going forward. And without that, the transformation would not have successfully happened. So if you're stuck in this boat, what do? The first thing is education. That's what we did with this senior executive. You have to explain what Agile is and also what it's not, because a lot of times senior execs have heard about Agile, or they've tried Agile, they think, and they've gotten a bad impression, or they've heard it doesn't work, or they misunderstand. They think it does mean you can change your requirements every day, and magically software will pop out of the other end. You've got to educate peers. You've got to educate senior management. You've got to get people to understand what this is. Second thing that has to happen that helps is to demo. You should be demoing. When you get going with Agile, and even if you're just doing it in your small team or your small group, at the end of every sprint, you should be demoing progress, tangible progress. What working software was built that you can visualize and see. And you should be giving constant demos to peer groups, to senior management, to anybody who will listen, because nothing beats a demo in showing progress and success. So do that as a way to demonstrate, hey, this is something that works, and look how fast we're able to build working software using this model and how much value we can add to our customers. And third, but not least, we have education, demonstration. Third is what I call advocation, which means you have to be constantly pushing the value and benefits of Agile and making that clear across the entire organization and up the chain. and be measuring the value you're bringing to the org. Make sure you are collecting metrics on the value that's coming out of the process and how it's going to date and how fast you've been able to move and the quality you've been able to achieve. Those are things that will get people's attention. Last but not least is what I call adopting too fast. I just wrote an article on this. So of course, Agile and DevOps is partially about speed, but interestingly enough, if you try to go too fast, oftentimes it results in going nowhere, right? Good example, we worked for quite a while with a Fortune 500 financial services organization, and we were in one specific part of that organization, and they were trying to adopt Agile across the board. The good news was they had air cover at the top. They believed in Agile. They thought it was the right way to go. They thought the business value and benefits were there, and they invested in training and coaches and other things to get the organization rolling. But in my opinion, they did it incorrectly. They did not, number one, take the time to socialize this to all of the management structure that sat between the executives who had bought in and the teams that were being asked to implement. Because of that, management didn't really understand Agile, and they didn't understand the impact it was going to have on their power structure, their management structure, and really didn't understand how this whole thing worked. The other thing was senior management was bought on the benefits, but they never really wanted to invest in the cost, right? They didn't want to spend the sweat equity and the capital it was going to take to do this right. They also had been sold that the answer was to scale Agile even before Agile had been put in place. And so they tried to top down create a scaling framework that would hook everything together that wasn't yet Agile. Result, unfortunately, because management in the middle controlled budgets and had authority for hiring and firing, if they didn't think that the Agile coach was doing it the way they wanted to do it, even if the way they wanted to do it was not Agile, they would just fire them and bring in another coach and try to get them to do it their way, even if their way wasn't at all Agile. Delivery was happening in various places in the organization, and senior management was using those as success stories, but they were really happening not because Agile was being done in a sustainable way, but because of heroic efforts in an unsustainable pace, which was killing people. And last but not least, metrics were used against the teams. So initially, they rolled out a self-assessment of maturity. And the goal was for it to be used to kind of reflect as a team on where you were, set some goals and priorities for getting to the next level, and move yourself toward maturity over time. And that was working really well until a new person came in who was responsible for the organization. And they said, well, we're not moving fast enough, so we're going to declare that everybody needs to be at level 3 by the end of the year. As you can imagine, the whole emphasis of the program shifted from how do we improve to how do we make it look like we're at level 3. And so now it was all about the number and convincing people, even if it wasn't true, that you were at a certain level that you were not at. As you can imagine, this did not work very well. What do you do if you're in a situation where your organization is trying to adopt too fast? How do you avoid these things? A couple of suggestions. First of all, I'm a huge fan of doing pilots. If you're going to do change, don't try to change everybody at once. Don't try to spread a bunch of coaches all over the planet and ask them all to help the teams change all at once. Pilot that change. Pick a particular project or product or division or whatever it is you think makes sense, and focus in and get that piece of the organization to change first. Because you're going to learn a lot about whether what you had thought you wanted to do in terms of Agile is actually implementable and going to work in your org. And that gives you time to tune and adjust it and refine it before you ask everybody to step up to it. It also builds internal champions, but it concentrates effort and coaching and training in an area where at the end of that, you have a set of people who buy in, who are passionate about it, who will go out and spread it to other places. Second is, and this gets to scaling models, build working code repeatedly and consistently across your teams before you try to scale. Question I always ask people that are embracing scaling models. Nothing wrong with scaling models. We need to scale Agile. But if nothing works on the teams, what are you scaling? All you're scaling is bad practices and software that doesn't work. Get your teams to the point where they deliver working code successfully, repeatedly. They don't have all the issues we mentioned in the last 4 reasons why Agile doesn't work. And then start thinking about how do we get those teams aligned so they work together effectively and the entire organization is in sync. Otherwise, you're just scaling something that doesn't work, and that's not going to help you at all. So those are my 5. I want to switch over and do one poll before we take questions. So which issues do you have in your organization? Pick any and all that you have. I'm curious which one of these resonated with folks and you feel like challenges that you have. A couple people said they don't have these challenges, which is awesome. Good for you. Share. Share, right? You're doing some things right. You're doing a lot of things right, and that's awesome. Let me share the results. Anyone last? Any last votes? Nope. Okay. So good news is right now people don't feel like they're adopting too quickly. That's awesome. The biggies, and no great surprise, Scrum Fall is everywhere. I don't know which of the 4 models. Maybe we should have asked you which ones you were following or you're seeing. And lack of automation is a biggie as well, followed closely by requirements, ever-changing. Executive buy-in seems like it's an issue for about 30%, and adopting too fast is bringing up the rear. So Scrum Fall's number 1. Interested in what you heard today, we do have a couple of live virtual classes coming up. You can get a 20% discount by using this promotional code. Thanking you for coming today. We have a Fundamentals of Agile class coming up. We have a Foundations of DevOps class coming up as well. Thank you very much for attending, and this is our way of thanking you. If you need any other help or you want information that I've provided today in terms of the papers I mentioned or anything, feel free to reach out to me or anyone involved in this, and we can get you that information. If you're interested in learning more about how we can help, certainly contact us as well. Let's take questions. And some orgs think they should be 100% automated. Others think automated testing is a waste of time. Is there a percentage of test automation we should strive for? So automation depends heavily on your organization. It depends on your product, depends on your environment, depends on a lot of things. So there's no one number that you should be shooting for. I think a better way to look at it is there are certain types of testing that it just makes a lot of sense to automate because of the time it takes to do them. Things like regression testing, for instance, unit testing, for instance, and also whether you're trying to move toward a continuous delivery or a continuous deployment process where every change you make is going to move automatically into production. There are people who, because of that, are 100% automated, but that is a very, very small percentage of organizations. And automate what makes sense is the simple answer. Of course, that's kind of a cop-out too, but take a good look at the return on investment for automation. It does cost extra to automate and maintain tests. And so you have to make sure you're getting benefit from those tests. And that means they have to run repeatedly without customization and update, or you're not getting value in just doing them manually. So think about that. How do you make requirements visible? Any recommended tools? Yeah, so this gets back to what I said. I mean, to me, you make up requirements visible, one, by mocking them, mocking UIs, rapid prototyping, anything you can do upfront, quick and dirty, to make the requirements visual from a screen perspective can help do that. Obviously, making sure you get your product owner and end customers into your user acceptance tests that you do at the end of your sprints helps as well as doing demos that we talked about, so a wider base can see what you've done and give you feedback on it. All of that, to me, as I mentioned, since I consider requirements not finished until you've gotten the user's acceptance, it's what they wanted. All of those things are part of the requirements process and visualizing those requirements. I'm running into my product owner doesn't write user stories. Well, how do I fix this? Yes. So there's a lot of debate about who writes user stories and how and when and where. I can tell you a lot of the organizations we go into, when we first get engaged in it, whether the product owner is engaged or not, they usually don't know how to write good user stories. And so we usually end up sitting down and often writing them a first cut ourselves, just really to model behavior, right? So we take a business level of requirements, for instance, that maybe they've come up with a business requirements doc or something high level, and we will just sit in a room and pound out a set of potential stories, build a backlog. And then we will iterate, turn around and sit down with them and walk through those and figure out which ones are good stories, aren't good stories, and iteratively with them rewrite them to get them in the loop. I mentioned that technology firm that we worked with. Once we got past the senior exec trying to figure out why we were there, one of the most productive things that happened was the product owner was very engaged, had never done Agile before and didn't know how to write stories. This was the organization who had spent a year trying to get through their requirements process. We literally sat down ourselves, our team, couple people, and took a business requirements doc, and we built a backlog in 2 days of as many stories as we could think of. And then we spent the next couple of days with the product owner, talking through each of those, ripping them up, rewriting them, splitting them apart, prioritizing them, putting them into a release board. And at the end of that first week, we had a plan. And it had taken them a year and they hadn't gotten there. And the light bulb went on for him because he saw the power of this process. And then we started coaching him on writing good stories going forward. So when he had new requirements, he could write them first cut, bring them to us. We'd edit them and we'd iterate with them until he got proficient, pretty much owning that process. So start like that. Start by enabling, by doing them some yourself. You're going to have to maybe do that, but always make sure the product owner is in the loop because it is ultimately their responsibility and they're the ones that have to prioritize what's most important. Many companies are trying to adopt, this is from Colleen, Agile as a process, trying to relate to what they used to do. You touched on that in the adopting too fast section, but how do you overcome this? Well, this is classic change, right? I mean, everybody wants to adopt something new, but they want to hang on to the past, right? That's classic change management. So how do you do that? Of course, educate, keep pounding. A good coach should make sure that teams and organizations aren't backsliding. So good coaches need to call teams out when they're doing that. A lot of coaches misunderstand. They hear servant leader, they hear I'm supposed to sit back, I'm supposed to observe, which is true, but we can't let a project go off the rails in the process. Yes, we can let teams make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, but we can't let them make catastrophic mistakes. And we certainly can't let them backslide. So we start with maybe suggesting, perhaps we're moving in the wrong direction. Here's what the Agile principles say. Can anybody think of ways to do this that meet the principles? We start there. Over time, we might need to get a little forceful and in retro say, look, we've backslid. And I want to throw that out there and talk about how we make sure that doesn't happen in the next sprint. How do we get back on track? That's the way I would do it. It's pretty classic coaching, but you got to coach with a little more than a I'm sitting back and just watching and observing. Sometimes you got to step in a little bit and nudge it in the right direction. There's a great couple of articles in Agile Connection on how to manage that process that you're in as a coach, whether you're an internal or an external coach. Handling where no requirements exist. Yeah, no, again, you're going to have to probably take a cut at writing them yourself based on whatever information you can get to your customers, get to people in the business side, sit down with them, brainstorm with them, write them up, review them with them. You have to have requirements ultimately. And that might mean you need to take the initiative to create a first set, but ultimately you got to make sure the business is in line with that for that process to work. Yeah, handle technical debt in Agile. Yeah, so technical debt, how do you handle it? Well, there's a couple ways you can handle it. So first of all, refactoring is an approach we use in Agile that says whenever we're working on a piece of code or we're working on some automated tests or whatever we're doing that there's code involved, and we see something that's not written properly or it smells, we call it, which means it's not very pretty, and we feel like it needs to be cleaned up or we're going to have maintenance problems or challenges or it's not going to be well understood, it's our job to clean it up as we implement whatever is new. Now, the reality is, though, sometimes you get into a code base and you find out there's so much that's wrong that you can't afford the time to fix it all and still get your work done. We can't just drop our commitments during the sprint and work on technical debt. What we can do as a team is make the decision that we are going to allocate a certain number of points to working off technical debt each sprint if we feel it's severe enough that there are things we just have to invest in cleaning up. Now, this is where some trust comes in with the business side, because of course we want you to put more and more features in as fast as you can, and they're not going to want to hear that you're spending any time cleaning up something that you messed up earlier. But if you can get to the point with your business to understand that if you don't do this now, the downstream consequences for quality, for maintenance costs, for supportability are going to be so far greater than the ongoing small cost we're going to have cleaning things up, then you have a chance of convincing the organization that's the right thing to do. Now, in a real Agile environment, the team's supposed to be able to do whatever they think is best. But let's face it, in most organizations, even if they say that, there is always pressure not to do that. So you're going to have to work hard to get the business to understand the impact of not cleaning things up. So Jacqueline, I find the consistent challenge is having the reason Agile will not work for our team is because our software is not Agile friendly. If you encounter software that is genuinely difficult, now that's an excuse, right? This is the snowflake excuse. And we hear this across Agile, DevOps, whatever it is, microservers, containers, whatever it is we are there to help with that somebody thinks is important. There's somebody who says we're special, we're unique. What you're advocating doesn't apply to us. I have not seen situations where Agile doesn't make sense or won't apply. Having said that, though, if you're not having issues, if your quality is good, if your process works, if your customers aren't screaming for more value faster, then I would argue you shouldn't just give up on what you're doing and move to anything else, whether it's Agile or something else. There has to be a business reason for moving to Agile. And just because everybody else is doing it is not a good enough reason. But I don't see situations where Agile, quote, won't work. I guess the only exception is there are some organizations that have a pathological culture, and that's a culture, if you studied, organizational culture, where everything is dictated from a dictator above, and and innovation is discouraged, feedback is discouraged, they shoot the messenger, and pretty much you do what you're told or you leave. Agile cannot thrive in that culture, right? It can't. And so I always tell people, if you're in that organization, thankfully there's not a lot of those, and you want to do Agile, you need to quit. Go somewhere else, because you're not going to get anywhere in your organization.
How to deal with
how do you deal with dev creating most requirements versus PO team? I hope I covered that. Again, there's nothing wrong with the team creating the requirements if you don't have any. We need requirements to build and test against. The problem is, though, you've got to get the business engaged in reviewing, vetting, validating, and prioritizing those requirements. That the team should never be doing, is prioritizing what gets done. That's the business's responsibility. I always say that's what they're getting the big bucks to do, is know what the customer wants. If they don't know what the customer wants, well then, honestly, they all ought to be fired, because that's their job fundamentally, right? And we can help, we can enable, we can write, we can coach, we can encourage, but ultimately they have to take ownership and start taking that over, or we're never going to really build something that customers value, because we don't know the customer like they do. Requirements created mostly post-code implementation. That's an interesting one. So I guess they're doing that for traceability or for regulatory compliance, or there's some driver for doing that, because usually if you get through implementation, you don't have any requirements, people go, well, I guess we didn't need them, and they don't do them. So I'm guessing there's some business reason why you need them. The organization just unfortunately is dysfunctional and is creating them later. That's not a good recipe for success. Definitely not Agile. I think that's all the questions. Wow, we still have 30 people hanging in there. Thanks for staying.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank everyone for participating today. You will receive an email later today that does contain a link to download the PDF of the materials, and as well a link to a recording of today's web seminar.